Hello, and welcome to the Artfully Learning audio series. I'm your host, Adam Zucker. On the blog component of Artfully Learning, I have written several posts about how art and maintenance are intrinsic. My investigation into the interdisciplinary relationship between art and education is largely focused around ways we can sustain and expand healthy and empowering relationships with each other and our surrounding social structures and ecosystems. Because of this, I am delighted to have a conversation with artist Sto Len, whose work addresses the effects of climate change that has been enhanced by plastic pollution and the maltreatment of our natural resources. Sto Len's unique printmaking process transports his practice from the studio environment into the heavily polluted waters of the Newtown Creek in New York City, as well as other local and global waterways. He improvises on traditional styles of suminagashi, which means floating ink, and gyotaku, meaning fish impression, to visualize the impact we have collectively had in polluting our water systems. Sto was recently appointed as the artist in residence with the New York City Department of Sanitation. Through this public role, he is elaborating on how art can make a philosophical and tangible difference across society. For some, art provides an escape from reality, but for Sto, art is a productive survival strategy in times of crisis. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sto to the conversation. I'm so glad that you're able to do this.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, this has been a long time coming, I think, for us to have this chat. So we met around 2017 at Spring Break Art Fair. And since then, we've periodically run into one another. But we haven't really had the opportunity to sit down and discuss the intricacies of your artwork and the social and pedagogical impact until now. So I'm really excited to delve into a few different but interrelated aspects of your work. First of all, I'm holding a copy of your book, Foam, Future of a Material, in my hands.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, your blog is really good too. I like, you're a good writer. I appreciated a lot of the stuff that you were covering.
Well, thank you. That's always great to hear. And it's great to read other artists' writing. This was the one book I kept coming back to during the early years of the pandemic. You truly synthesized a lot of the thoughts, feelings, and unknowns that were spiraling through our collective culture. The way you wrote was perfect because it does combine so many different ideas and so many different techniques that writers use. And so,
yeah, totally.
Also, you must have had a background in writing.
Yeah, I mean, not like formally, but always writing. I think and when I was younger, I would do a lot of zines. So I made a lot of zines as a teenager. That was sort of really the first artwork that I would publicly put out into the world, I think, was like zine form. And so, yeah, like writing, I'm sure, a lot of bad poetry, just teen angsty writing, but really great for one to do that. I mean, I think it's good to just practice how your sort of style with language and also empowering to put that out there and vulnerable too. You're like, I mean, you put your writing out in the world. It's definitely like, here it is, here.
Right. And especially in the internet culture, trolling is a problem. My blog, I feel like this content's so niche that it's not an echo chamber, but it's like there's not going to be too many antagonistic responses to it. There is debate, which I like, and I welcome that. And I think we certainly need that, because that's what as an educator too, that's something that, I don't want everyone to be indoctrined into my thoughts. So
no, that's
the whole goal, that we as artists have conversation, and we're putting our work out there to be evaluated and judged. So that's, it's being vulnerable. Yeah. But I really love Foam, Future of a Material. And it is like really about the future, but also it gives us insight into your artistic development.
Yeah.
That's something I'd like to talk about today, is both those aspects. So you mentioned your earliest artistic activities were zine making. Was there anything earlier than that? How did you decide to get into art?
That's just something that I really kind of always did. I mean, I think that we all kind of started off as artists, and then some of us just never stop, And I definitely, I think, I'm an only child. And so I spent a lot of time alone drawing or painting, or just sort of entertaining myself with art. So that was always my best friend, kind of, it was like the thing that you could just do, And then, in high school, I think was when I started to like paint, it's like I'm going to be a painter, and like kind of like really getting into paint on canvas and taking that, seriously. Like I was a pretty serious teenager, I was like painting and going to protests and going to punk shows and just really sort of engaged in art in that way. That I think for me is empowering. It definitely, I felt like I had an outlet to like put stuff through. But yeah, so always painting pretty much, and drawing and writing. And then zines, when that sort of idea, when I got other people's zines and realized that you could just go to a copy shop and make art in the copy shop, that was really a huge revelation for me. So I would go to Kinko's and just hang out with coffee and use all their glue sticks, and and I used to be able to get I somehow, and I forget, it's like I knew someone who worked at a Kinko's, but you would get these copy cards and you'd pay them like $10 and they would have like $100 on them. And so I would just make hundreds of copies, and play on the Xerox machine and moving things around and collaging and like actually collaborating with the Xerox machine. But I feel like that's like the first things that I really showed people and made copies of and put that out into the world. I lived in the DC area, and I would go just hang out on the mall, like the National Mall, in front of like the monuments, and sell my zines or give them away. And I would go to the Greyhound bus station. This was my genius idea, to go to the Greyhound and sell people my zines, because they were like waiting to get on the bus, and they were like, it'd be like $1 or 50 cents or whatever it was. It was like nothing. And then they would have something to read on the bus,
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was kind of like, I feel like my earliest art making was all of those things. And then, I think like a lot of kids, you don't really know what you want to do when you grow up. But the one thing I did know is that I just loved art, and I loved art history, and I loved music, and I just sort of wanted to be part of that somehow, like just the overall conversation of art. And so I went to art school. It was just kind of like just nothing else I wanted to do more than go to art school and just immerse myself in art all day long. So I went to I grew up in the DC area, and I went to VCU in Richmond, Virginia, because it seemed like a cool town, but also Guar are from Richmond, and they had gone to that art school, and there's like a really interesting history of weirdo art punks in Richmond. In DC, the punk scene there is obviously legendary, and it was a huge influence on me. But as a city, and even as a punk scene, it's like kind of uptight, it's like kind of like stiff. And Richmond was really loose and grimy, and just sort of more. Everyone seemed friendlier to also, and just kind of down for anything. So I went to art school, and that was the first time I ever made like straight A's. I was like really into it, because I got to do art all day long, and it was amazing. For me, there was sort of nothing else I wanted to do.
Yeah, growing up, I had similar experiences, making copies in the Kinko's. I remember, I don't even know if Kinko's exists anymore, actually, now that I think of it. But that was like, the punk kid with like the greasy hair standing in the Kinko's, and everyone else, sort of the businessmen coming in and looking at you funny because you're like printing out these compositions of like collaged imagery. And it's really a formative part of so many artists' development. And it's also taught in schools, because it's so accessible, and students can really express themselves perfectly through that medium.
I remember like I would have pen pals, and we like across the country, and we would send each other stuff like Xerox like whole books, and like send them to people, or like, just trading information on art and punk and like subcultural stuff. I was like obsessed. I mean, I'm pretty much still am, but that was basically my favorite thing to do. It was either make it or thinking about it, or reading it, or going to a show or something like that. And DC, the museums are all free too, so I feel like I went to the museum significantly more because of that. And then the punk shows are all ages, so that's I realize now that was a rare thing, but at that time it was like, oh yeah, I can get in. I'm 12. I'm like really, really small, but nobody cares. It's totally okay for me to be there. And that was like huge thing for me, like super inspiring.
The educational value behind all ages shows and accessible culture, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, it really is, I mean, it's crazy to bar people from things because of their age and like art and music.
The thing that I wanted to respond to about your artistic development, your upbringing, your education, and that is, so you had basically this DIY impulse. The beginning was making the zines, which is very much, you did it on your own, and you probably were inspired by definitely the subculture, the punk rock subculture, seeing some of the early punk rock zines that were very formative in the music industry, or not the music industry, but the punk rock subculture, which sort of eschewed that music industry. And then you went to art school. So it's sort of two very different sides of the coin in many ways. But as you said, you got the vocabulary when you went to art school through taking art history classes. Looking at your work now, you've retained both sides, that radical DIY, very punk rock edged, with this nod to art history and nod to the cultural aspects of making and discussing art. Your printmaking, it's gone from, I mean, I know you still make zines, but it's gone from that whole Xeroxing to now making prints using the environment and other objects. And in sort of your punk rock ethos, you've been making this profound statement about our environment, our future, and our materials. I think punk rock's a very material culture. So you are responding with that philosophy and shifting that narrative to talk about, the environmental impact that consumerism and materialism actually has. So if we could talk about how you got into the method of printmaking that you do now, and what it entails, how it's evolved, and what you've learned from it.
Yeah, totally. That's a good question. I do think that the earliest forms of printmaking were with the Xerox machine, and I think what I loved about that is the act of making multiples. I think I got into that. It's collating zines or just making prints of things. I found it to be really rewarding, and I think I just love a process. With printmaking, there's always the setup, and you kind of always know what to do because there's always like a set thing that you set up to make the prints, whatever kind of printmaking it is. And then also, I think when I started learning about printmaking and activism, the connection of kind of making posters and putting them up on walls, and handing out flyers, and the dissemination of information through printmaking was super inspiring to me. And so, I started to just try all the different forms, but I was sort of not good at any of them, to be honest. Etching, it just wasn't really my thing. I tried them all, lithography, but screen printing was my favorite, even though I was not technically a good screen printer. I was always really messy. I'm just sort of like inherently kind of a messy artist, but I really enjoyed it. I really like the process, doing the physical labor of it. I really enjoyed, and the sort of the matte tones and the colors that you can get through screen printing, I really loved. But honestly, I mean, I did all of those things, but it was only until I started to discover suminagashi that I kind of like found my printmaking technique, And it's funny how I discovered that too, because it was by accident, totally by accident. But I was in Japan. I did an art show in Tokyo, and at that time I was doing these like paper mache sculptures, and I've always been obsessed with paper and the fact that it is like a really accessible kind of thing you can get. But I was using recycled paper, making these paper mache sculptures, and just when I was in Tokyo, I just loved the calligraphy. I really kind of fell in love with all the handwritten signs and menus and things that I would see. And I started taking photographs of them and collecting them. And then, I got some sumi ink, and I wanted to sort of learn or try to write Japanese calligraphy. And I definitely went through a period of just practicing. And I think the sumi ink, it's like so beautiful and black, and elegant, and it's like, if you ever paint with it, it's a really smooth line. And as a painter, I just fell in love with the way it comes off the brush. And it's like you can dip the brush and paint this like endless line, it feels like, without having to re-dip your brush. So I was really taken with it. And when I came back to New York, I started to make abstract paintings pretty much, and just sort of trying to find my line, and like see what distinguishes my line from anyone else's. And I think at that time I was going through stuff too, and it was just a really therapeutic thing to do, just like endlessly work on lines and painting. And, this went on for a while. And then at some point I accidentally spilled sumi ink on water. I had like a bucket of water. I realized that it floated. And then I realized that you could kind of make a floating painting with the ink. And then if you put paper on it, it actually makes a print. And, honestly, I thought I didn't know if anyone else knew about this. I was like, this is amazing. I'm a genius. But I think, I don't know. It didn't take long for me to like research it or Google it or something, and I was like, oh, this is a thing called suminagashi, which translates to floating ink, and it dates back to the 12th century. This is something that the Shinto monks were doing in the countryside of Japan. But what was cool about that was, I think reading about the Shinto religion, they're animist, and the way that they saw suminagashi was a collaboration with the water. Like the human spirit and the water spirit are, equal. And the monks would do this meditation practice and make these floating paintings. And if you're able to print from the water, it's like an act of divination. You're actually like connecting your spirits to the water. And so, I'm not religious, but I do love that idea. And I like to think of humans and water and animals and rocks as, basically all on the same plane of existence, So I kind of really ran with that notion in my own way and started to make prints, these suminagashi prints, and those floating paintings for me were collaborations with the water. And it kind of freed me up in this nice way where it was less about me. And, if you ever work with something like water, you can't totally control it. So, you might have an idea of what you want to do, but once it interacts with water, it's going to take it where it wants to go, and so that collaboration for me became super important, and it helped me kind of let go of control as well and allow for just being okay with like what was going to happen and happy accidents and experimentation, and so I worked on this for years, and I started to get inflatable swimming pools in my studio, and the prints got bigger and bigger, and they became colorful. I started working with color again, just making these floating paintings that were essentially experiments with water. And, I started to use rainwater and kind of add more natural elements into the pools. And then, at some point I saw a photograph of a BP oil spill, and I was like, oh my God, I was just really struck by how beautiful it was. It was like actually just aesthetically beautiful, but obviously a totally tragic, horrible situation that we created. But you couldn't deny aesthetically, it was really beautiful. It was a lot like what I was trying to do in the studio. I was like, oh, I'm making these floating oil spills in these controlled environments in an inflatable swimming pool. What if I worked with a real oil spill? I moved to New York in 2000. I immediately started hanging out on the waterfronts, especially at that time in Williamsburg. The waterfront was like post-apocalyptic paradise. There's like no one out there, there were like burned up cars. It was like Mad Max vibes. But I got to know the water, and specifically Newtown Creek was a place I really like to hang out in along the coast there. And, that's the site of a crazy big oil spill. And also that is where a lot of the sewage dumps out after heavy rainfalls, combined sewage overflow into the creek. And so you would see, I would just be hanging out, drinking a beer down by the water and just see like how crazy it looked with sewage and God knows what, floating on the surface. And so, I kind of just put that stuff together and was like, well, what if I went out into the creek, and I ended up buying a boat on Craigslist for $100, and I started rowing around the creek armed with tons of paper, and I started printing from the actual surface of the water. That was a big revelation for me because I was like, oh, wow. Like, I had been into this idea of collaborating with water, but I hadn't necessarily considered all the water around me, And in New York, we're surrounded by water, basically living on islands, and yet no one thinks about it really. The water is something you like go under or over, it's just getting you to the other borough or whatever. So I really liked that. I liked collaborating with these sort of unseen spaces in the city, and it busted me out of the studio. All of a sudden, my studio was like this rowboat, or it was like the Newtown Creek, or it was a coastline. Those printmaking sessions would be an all-day affair. I would just take forever to kind of go out there and then find a good spot for printing. And then the prints are wet and they're kind of gross and toxic. And I have to carefully get them out of the water. And I would usually put them on shore and let them dry for an hour, where I would just hang out, And so it was like kind of like going fishing or something. You just like spend this whole day out on the water. And I was like, this is way better than just being in my little studio. It's like, yes, it was just really liberating. And I think from there, it opened me up to all different kinds of printmaking and the idea of like kind of collecting the imprints in the world and thinking about what the human imprint on the planet is. And the prints became a way to map those impressions that we leave, our carbon footprints, our oil spills, our abuse of the planet, And it was a way for me to kind of learn more about that stuff too, and learn about the city I live in, and learn about the industrial histories, and learn about other places that I visited. So it became a way for me to really engage with the world through art in a way that I hadn't really done before, So I think printmaking is definitely my core practice. And it's through that, it's like I've just sort of like gone on all these other tangents, from there.
It's all interconnected. The medium and the environment, the oil and the water, and they work both together and separate, both in art and nature, right? That are intrinsic to both our environment and our artistic practice. So
yeah,
it makes a lot of sense that's what drew you to the water. Yeah, of course, the way you went about it is a totally distinct path from, other artists, other contemporary artists. You do look back into the tradition of printmaking, as you mentioned, especially using a Japanese technique, which is gyotaku. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but the gyotaku printmaking technique, which is historically, which I learned from you, is a practice where fishermen would make imprints of their catches, their daily catches, as a way to keep a record of it. So it's interesting the way you have interpreted that. We're talking about how art is connected to history and the contemporary experience. You're using that method as a way to record our daily catch, what we are catching in our waters today, our waterways, which is sadly mostly pollution, not fish.
Yeah.
And so your prints, your gyotaku prints, I know you've come up with a name for what you've done with your prints. They're called gomitaku.
It's a made-up word, but it does technically. I asked my Japanese friends, and they're like, "Yeah, it's cool. You can use that. I'll start using that too. So. But it's just being trash impression. But I know I love thinking about history, and I love thinking about the lineage of art, but also, world history and environmental history. And I think that the idea of someone, a fisherman back in the day, right, in the 19th century, perhaps going fishing, they're probably not going to find that much trash. They're probably just going to find fish, maybe like a random object, but like certainly no plastic, right? The styrofoam, none of that stuff had been invented yet. So the majority of the trash in our waterways is plastic, and this is all stuff that's basically come into our lives, in the last 40 years. And there's so much of it, though. It's like, it's just mind-boggling to think how quickly we polluted the planet with this stuff that's going to outlive all of us, and that's another crazy thing. The piece of styrofoam could potentially live, for 500 years, 1,000 years. spending time in the water, you just really see it. You see the amount, and it's like everyone knows, yeah, the water's polluted, but I think when you really see it firsthand, and you're like in a tiny boat and you're like going through it, it's really emotional. I mean, it's really sobering. It's really shocking and overwhelming, And I mean, I just deal with stuff. I process stuff like this with art. It just like helps me kind of like deal with it and try to understand it. And I think the act of trying to make something with it that is maybe beautiful or interesting or a conversation starter, that is something that I just really enjoy, that challenge. I'm half Vietnamese, and I grew up in America, was born in America, but I went to Vietnam for the first time in 2015, and I was dying to go. I mean, I couldn't wait. I waited my whole life to go, and I just really wanted to connect with my roots and my family who had all left during the war or after the war. But I just really needed to go. And of course, one of the first things I wanted to do was go on the water. Water is such a huge, important part of Vietnam. Even the word water, Nuoc, it's the word for country. They're like sort of synonymous, But what I found going on boat rides through Vietnam and through Saigon, where there's 8,000 canals in Saigon, which is where my family is from, they're intensely polluted. I mean, they're horribly polluted. I had never seen anything like that. New York City doesn't hold a candle to the amount of pollution that people are dealing with on a daily basis. So I don't know. It was like I knew, I knew it was probably going to be bad in some parts, but just seeing that stuff firsthand and seeing all these lovely people living in it, like really living in it, like wading through the water, washing their clothes in the same water that you just see a sea of, it's all single-use plastic. It was used once, that's also such a mind-boggling thing. Yeah, I came back to the States just so sad, but wanting to make art about it. And so I started collecting the stuff to kind of like do some sort of investigation on these materials like styrofoam, and then I had started doing gyotaku with fish as a way to kind of like experience that tradition. But I'm not I don't fish actually, so I was like buying fish and like printing it and then eating it, which is kind of lovely. But at the same time, I had been fishing out foam and bottle caps, and I'd been fishing out all this crap out of the water, and I had bags of it in the studio. So yeah, I again was just like, well, maybe I'll try to use this stuff, and that's what I ended up doing. Was just kind of beginning this process of inking the actual piece of garbage and rubbing a print out of it, and in a funny way that's like very intimate process. You like rub this thing that you sort of hate, but you like caress it and make this print with it. So it's like an interesting process.
Yeah. So on that note, when you mentioned that intimate process, which is obviously something that you can tell in the delicate nature of your work, it's a labor of love.
Yeah.
Something that most of us, especially in New York, where there's a lot of visible trash, that's something we avoid. And we just, as you say, the same way with the waterways, we just walk around it. We never really take into account its presence. Or if we do, it's just ignored. I mean, we're good at ignoring things in New York. I think that's one of the typical identities of a New Yorker. It's that we just are able to go ahead without, and that's both good and bad. And in this case,
totally.
The art you're making, we have to look. It's so arresting. It's so captivating. Just the beauty of it. When you look at it, you don't really, on first glance, even know that it is this tender interaction with human waste. And in the same sense, too, that has a lineage to art history. This idea of found object art, of course, is everyone might think first of something like Duchampian fountain, where, just repurposing discarded items to make art. In this case, there's also that history with social practice, more contemporary movement, where actual activism is part of the art making. There's an educational purpose behind the work. The work that's where your work fits in a lot as well. And
Yeah.
I was so excited when I heard you were selected to be an artist in residence with the New York Sanitation Department, because
Yeah.
that totally, I mean, it totally makes sense. And
Perfect.
the legacy with that, of course, it was just one artist before you. So you are,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, you are the second artist ever to have this position.
Yes.
It's a big deal,
An honor.
and it's an honor, especially the shoes you are filling in with Merle Lederman Euclid, who's a legend.
She's a hero.
She's a hero. She's
hero to me.
She's fantastic. I mean, I've certainly written about her work a lot and discussed her work a lot.
Oh, cool.
And what she did with Touch Sanitation, her idea was as much of a public relations campaign as a work of performance art.
Sure.
It was educational, because these are people who, I mean, most of us don't even see. They come early in the morning to collect our trash. They work in big warehouses, often like Staten Island and the outer boroughs, Queens. You know, I see the big facilities when I'm on the highways or when I'm, headed out of the city. So most of us don't even see this in New York. We don't know what they do. I mean, I remember school trips actually going to these facilities. It was some of the best class trips that I remember. And it's something great that any teacher should do, especially art teachers, because they talk about material and
oh my God,
the amount of it. And not only that, I mean, you could speak to this too, but there is such a legacy with the sanitation department and both collecting and making art, because obviously I'm sure many of us artists have discarded paintings that just didn't work, so that, where does that go? There's people that collect it, and one person's trash is another person's treasure, is the saying. And
that's right.
You're in the process of sort of doing an archival project alongside collaborating with sanitation workers and people throughout the agency, and making your own art in response to the contemporary experience and the history of trash collection, recycling, and repurposing in New York City. So I'd love to just hear your experience overall with that. How did that come about? How did you become the second artist, first of all, to get this position, and what are you doing now in your role there?
Well, like you said, I mean, Merrill Letterman Euclid is such an inspiration to so many artists, of my generation and of younger generations. And I think it's funny, when I first moved to New York, which was 22 years ago, I remember someone saying to me, there's an artist in residence at the Department of Sanitation. I don't think they knew that Merrill's name. They didn't know what she did, but they just knew that was a thing. And that, like, I remember that just lodged in my brain. And I didn't learn who she was or what her art was for years. I wasn't taught anything about Merrill in art school either. And I'm glad that she has been able to get a lot more recognition in the last decade, because her work is super important. But so I was always curious about this position. I think just the idea of it was really radical and exciting to me, even 20 some odd years ago. And then when I did learn about Merrill's work, and I went to her retrospective at the Queens Museum, I was kind of blown away with the depth of her work. And at this point, she's made work technically for 40 years about the New York Department of Sanitation and sort of sanitation and maintenance in general, and so, her legacy inspired the residency program I'm in, which is something that the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York created in 2015, called the Public Artists in Residence. And so they were inspired by Merrill's work. They created this whole residency program, and they would get, usually it's around 2 to 3 artists a year, and they would place them in different city agencies. And they've, put artists in really interesting spaces, like the Office of Immigration. Someone's in homeless services right now. Someone was in the Department of Design and Construction for New York. So super fascinating places to be as an artist. And the residency lasts for 1 year minimum, and it's has a pretty good budget and everything. So you can kind of just focus on that primarily. But the application for the sanitation department came up in 2021, and that was the first time they were ever offering that. So when I saw that, I jumped at the application. I applied to it, and luckily I got it. And it was, to me, I was like, oh my God, this is like the ultimate dream for me. Because I think as an artist, working pretty much independently on all my work as just like a single person, pretty much, and just sort of dealing with the waste as a citizen, as an individual human artist person, I was super interested to see the other side of the coin, like the people who do kind of deal with the waste. What does that look like, and who's doing that work? When I got it, I basically read up as much as I could on sanitation. There's a great book called Picking Up by Robin Nagel, who is an anthropologist and who actually became a sanitation worker for a while to continue her study of sanitation. But anyways, yeah, her book was a really cool window into it. But there's nothing like just embedding oneself in an agency. And it was an honor to get it, but also totally overwhelming because this is the largest sanitation department in the world. There's 10,000 employees. There's like, I think 200 different buildings across 5 boroughs. They're dealing with 12,000 tons of garbage a day. What does that look like? How do you even penetrate that system? Like, what are you going to do? One artist, like, what are you going to do? It's intense, and then on top of that, Meryl's legacy, right? I mean, who's a huge inspiration to me, but I was kind of like, what am I going to do? She's done everything. She's had 40 years to make art about sanitation, so one of the first things I did was meet Meryl. I was like, I gotta meet Meryl. We gotta talk. Like for one, I just really wanted her blessing. I wanted her to say, like, go for it, but I also just wanted to pick her brain on what she did and how she got started. And so it was really cool. I got to hang with her. She was moving some stuff. So I hung out with her and kind of helped her move some ephemera and artwork and stuff. And it was amazing because she's just such a wealth of knowledge and of stories and stuff. But also, it was cool to hear her say, I researched for a year and a half before I even embarked on the touch sanitation piece. I mean, I just showed up and like absorbed and listened, and so I took that same approach. I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And the cool thing about the residency is that they actually don't want you to know what you're gonna do. They want you to get to know the agency, which makes a lot of sense, and puts a lot of trust in the artist. But I think that's the way to go. You can't come into a place like that and go, I know exactly what I'm gonna do. You guys, I'm the artist, like, let's do this thing. It's like, nah, actually, you should probably get to know the people. You should form real relationships. You should learn as much as possible about the history. So that's what I did. And I spent the first 4 months of the residency just deep dive. They have, my main liaison was the head of the records department. And so I hung out in her office every day, and it was just like full of boxes of ephemera, old photographs, files, old sanitation annual reports and magazines. And this is like over a century of stuff to go through and like get my paws on it, is amazing. Right. So I did that. And then it was important for me to go in person and experience the waste stream, so I did ride-alongs on collection trucks so I could see what that was like what is it like for the people who are going around picking up the garbage, and what does that look like as a process. And that was so fascinating. I wish everyone could do that, because talk about you never think about it the same again, and I did that a bunch, and I actually got to ride along with my personal sanitation workers, which was amazing. I asked if I could do my neighborhood, and coincidentally, I got paired with the 2 guys who routinely do my street, and that was amazing. I now Frank and Egan. I mean, I know them, I'm on first name basis with these guys. I see them all the time. They're really great guys. We like came on my block, and I was like, oh my God, this is my garbage, But it was a great experience, and now I see them all the time, and they're friends, but I also, I'm someone who thinks about this stuff a lot, but I'm like on another level now where I'm like making sure the garbage is, done right, because I know who's picking it up. I know them, and I want them to be safe, and I don't want it to be too heavy and all that stuff. So that was an incredible experience. And then also going to the waste transfer stations, which there's a bunch in every borough. And those are incredible spaces just as a physical space. New York City, we all have like usually these tiny spaces that we're in. These garages are humongous, because they're dumping out 12,000 tons of garbage, so these are giant spaces with giant trucks that come in and dump the garbage, and I asked if I could just stand in front of a truck as it dumped out onto it's called the tipping floor, where all the garbage gets dumped. And that's, talk about an experience. You're just standing there as the rain of garbage comes down and forms this giant mountain in front of your eyes. One truck is like a couple tons, it's a gargantuan, amount of stuff. So, experiencing that, talking to all the workers was a big part of my process, and, then I went to the incinerators. We use incinerators, right? New York City puts a lot of its garbage on boats, on barges, and those get shipped down the Hudson River or the East River to Newark, New Jersey. I went to the incinerator there called Covanta, and just saw that process, which is a totally insane process where they burn our garbage, and then, I got to go to the Fresh Kills landfill, which is not it's not in operation as a landfill anymore, but that accepted New York City's garbage since the late 40s up until 9/11 was the last stuff that it accepted. So talk about an insane landscape. These mountains that are covered in grass now, and they've pretty much remediated most of it, into a park. But it looks sort of like a nice park, and then there's these little methane wells that stick out that are emitting gas so the place doesn't blow up, Even though I think the gas is pretty low at this point. But anyways, all these spaces, they're all so loaded with history and loaded with messages and meanings and material to make art with, just sort of conceptually, One thing that people often ask me is, are you making art with garbage? And actually I'm not with Sanitation. The garbage is picked up and basically put away. Like, I don't interact with the trash itself. So I'm, as a resident artist, making art with sanitation workers, with the history, and with contemporary issues, and I didn't know what that was going to look like, but after months of research, I said, okay, the research doesn't stop, but I do want a studio. I just want somewhere to go. And so they were like, you should check out the Central Repair Shop. It's in Woodside, Queens. It's huge. It's like the size of the Empire State Building if it was on its side. And there's a lot of people there, and they repair stuff. There's woodworkers, there's mechanics, there's a metal shop, there's an upholsterer, and there's a paint shop. And they make all the signs down there. Maybe you would like to be down there. And I said, I really want to check it out, And so when I got a tour, in the sign painting shop, they used to do that all by hand. They would hand paint the signs, hand paint the sides of the trucks, or they would screen print, aluminum signs that you see throughout the city that say like "don't litter" and all that kind of messaging, But they haven't been screen printing for, I would say, maybe almost 2 decades. All that stuff is now vinyl. So they print out vinyl lettering. They print out the vinyl that goes on the aluminum for the signs and stuff, which is super cool to see that process. But they had an old screen printing shop that hadn't been used, in a long time. when I saw it, I said, could I use this stuff? And they were like, oh my God, yeah, like no one's uses it. I mean, it's basically, we can get rid of it if you want. I was like, no. I want to reuse everything, And so they let me have that as my studio. And I kind of got this screen printing shop back in operation, and it had all the old screens, So I was really interested in how the sanitation conveyed messages to the public. What's the visual language look like? How do you tell people over and over not to litter, or like don't dump, or all that kind of stuff. And it was so fun to learn that visual language by actually doing, like, printing it, with the old designs. And so, I made the department like a straight copy of all the prints, which they didn't have. And then I started to do my own remixes of all that material, and incorporating all my other, printmaking techniques with the sanitation messaging, and really having fun with that stuff, and then I was already there for several months when someone mentioned to me there was a TV studio in the same building. And I said, take me there, please. And we, took a while, I think, to find someone with a key. But once I finally got in there, I was like, this is incredible. This is an old TV studio. They used to shoot stuff. There's like an old set, and old machines, old tape machines, projectors. And there are all these cabinets full of tapes and films. I mean, we're talking like 500-600 videotapes and film reels. And I said, I mean, do you guys know like what's on these tapes? And they're like, no, I don't know. It's like old stuff. Like, we don't think any of the machines really work. You probably can't play that stuff. And they just had never really tried. It was really obsolete machines, Betamax tape machines, 3/4-inch videotape, 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter. But I was like, I would love to try to play this stuff, And so, sure enough, I fired up some of the machines, still worked, and I started popping tapes in, and they were incredible, incredible stuff. And there's stuff on film from 1903 all the way until, I'd say, like, it's basically like the early 1900s to the early 2000s is what's in this room. And I was just dumbstruck, and I said, okay, like, I think, like, I have to sort of help preserve this, because it didn't seem like anyone was going to do it, and it's not because maybe they didn't want to, but it just because everyone's got jobs, like they're all doing other stuff, and I'm the artist in residence. I can kind of do whatever I want in a way. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to, like, try to digitize this stuff, preserve it. But, I want to have the freedom to make stuff with all this footage. And so they were like, yeah, absolutely. So I just started chronologically digitizing this stuff, and I'm probably, like, I don't know, maybe 250 tapes in at this point. But it's incredible stuff, and it's not only is it the history of sanitation, but it's the history of New York, and it's also the history of ecological awareness, because you see people, like, consider recycling. You see people consider these issues they just hadn't had to think about, because it wasn't really like a problem yet, and so you see, like, society kind of waking up and having to deal with all this shit, and you see, these parts of the city that have changed so much, since the 70s or the 80s, and so that's been so fascinating. And I've learned more that way than anything else. I mean, besides, like, in person, kind of experiences, the combination of that, like, experiencing, having real relationships with people. And then when I'm digitizing, it's like I hit play and I hit record. You have to do it in real time. And so I'm just, like, watching all this footage, and learning a ton, But so at this point, I was kind of thinking, like, okay, like, what are things I could do, And so they have these flat screen TVs in all the sanitation buildings, and they're controlled by one person, and they usually put, like, news of the day, or things that people should be aware of that week, and they're in all the different sanitation buildings. And I made friends with her, and I said, hey, if I give you videos, can you put them on the screens? And she was like, I would love that, because we kind of just run the same stuff over and over. So I started making videos for her, and they go up on the screens. And, first I introduce myself, like, hi, I'm the artist in residence, and then I start kind of doing slideshows of the stuff that I've been doing. And then I show them some archival footage that I just dug up and digitized. And then I always have a contact info, like my number. I have like a sanitation hotline number, and I have an email. And so people will leave me messages telling me like, oh man, my father, was in that film, or like people have a lot of stories about the stuff that I'm digitizing, and want to know more. And so I'll invite them to the studio and show them stuff, and then I started interviewing people when they come in. So they're coming into the studio, I'm showing them footage, and I'm interviewing them and getting their stories and their oral history down as well. So it's been really cool to interact through the history, and then kind of yet again, kind of like flipping that and remixing that. And I think ultimately, I want to do immersive video installations with this stuff, and I want to make a film. I think like an archival footage, art, documentary, kind of abstract film that encapsulates a lot of the stuff that I've seen, because I just want people to see it too, and experience it. So that's like kind of a big angle, and pretty much right now I'm still in the grind of digitizing and editing stuff and making short little pieces for the sanitation screens, and for, I share a lot of stuff on social media as well. And yeah, I'm continuing to meet sanitation workers who are an incredible group of people. At this point, I know the community, I know the culture, it's 10,000 people. So there's language and customs and culture and history. And I feel like I'm pretty versed in all that stuff, to where I'm, kind of able to kind of not be a voyeur, but really be in it, and that's important to me, to be a participant and a collaborator. Again, I just sort of just want to collaborate with the department as a whole, and with its history. And so that's, the main stuff that I've been doing. I had to give it a name, so I call it the Office of Invisibility, which is my personal office within the department. The department has all these different offices, the Office of Public Affairs, and so I'm the Office of Invisibility. And it's great. Now people bring me stuff that they want visible or saved. They say, hey, I found like 500 photographs, you should have these. I don't know what to do with them. I know you'll take care of them. And, so I've been also a depot where people can bring me stuff, and I'll save it, digitize it. Someone just gave me like hundreds of cassette tapes. And I mean, I pulled one out the other day, and it was like a recycle wrap demo tape that someone had just sent sanitation department. It's so good. It was like amazing, actually. And then I reached out to that person. I haven't heard back from them, but I did find them on Facebook. But I was like, I found your demo tape from 1990.
Oh, wow. So maybe you could send me some of those tracks. We could put it on the on this audio series here, so people can actually listen to it. That's
I'll
so
I'll throw one on there. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
I mean, and through your research and your archival work and your collaborations and remixes of original sanitation graphics, some of these graphics I hadn't seen myself since the early 90s. That was like my New York City heyday. And even it's a lot has changed, in their messaging since then, but seeing some of those really cool graphics. And there was a magazine, the sanitation department had its own magazine, which I guess social media has sort of displaced or superseded this kind of messaging. But these things are both nostalgic and also, as you said, a great way of looking back at the history of New York City and the human condition at a larger picture, because it shows how our consciousness has been raised, and visual campaigns have a lot to do with it. So that's the work that you've been doing with these sanitation department workers, the different agencies and departments. You are making it visible. So this is something that most of us would never be privy to.
No.
Otherwise, that's really the benefit of arts being integrated in the fabric of our civilization at large.
Absolutely.
It's such a good example. Beyond that, you're humanizing this major issue here of human waste, the waste that we're producing. It's a big problem that we are dealing with, and we're going to have to consider new ways of working with trash and interacting with our environment and producing less waste. But in a way, you are presenting some of the solutions to that or proposing ways of rethinking.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the rethinking part, I do feel like I've been able to sort of bring to light. I think that so much of it is that we don't think about it, or we don't want to think about it. And it's like kind of really an out of sight, out of mind phenomenon. And that is a fundamental thing that we have to change. Because, if you think about what's going in your wastebasket and you really try to minimize that, I mean, it's, it might seem like a small gesture, but that's something that you can't actually do. Like, that's in your power, and I think that's legitimate. Like, if everyone really did that, like, not to be cheesy, but that, that has a ripple effect, right? And so that's where you start. And then, and then you think about the people dealing with it. And it's this weird, intimate relationship, like, here's all my discards. Like, there's really personal stuff in there. There's stuff that helps sustain you. There's like, all my trash is basically food stuff, and that's all stuff that I mean, I'm alive because of this stuff, basically, right? And then you hand it off to the sanitation worker, and that's like this, I think it's like this like really intimate thing, and then they take it and they deal with it for you, and that's the way that's done. Is, I mean, I feel like they're pretty good at doing that. I think that what we need to work on is how much of that stuff there is, and we need to, like, on the sanitation end, we do need to think about how we dispose of it. It's like, at this point, it's incineration and landfill, and this is what we do, and this is what everybody does. But is that okay? I don't know. I mean, those are complicated issues. And the problem with New York is that none of that stuff happens here. We export our problems, and that's just how it is. Like, I feel like there's a lot of things that could be done to change that, but right now we bury our garbage in Virginia, in Ohio, and we burn our stuff in New Jersey, and it's sort of, in a lot of ways, it's like not fair to those people who live in those communities, but yeah, that's like a super crazy situation that a lot of cities deal with. We export garbage and don't really deal with it. So, all that to say is, yeah, I think that, like, it starts with recognizing your place in it, as an individual, and then you sort of have to visualize where that stuff goes. And a lot of people, they don't get that far in the thinking, like, they don't know where their garbage goes, or they don't even consider the humans that are dealing with it. So I think that's huge. If we deal with that stuff, we start thinking about that stuff, and then we start thinking about what we're buying, and, like, how we're consuming stuff, and then we can take it from there. But obviously, the big change has to happen on the top of the manufacturing level. If manufacturers are not allowed to make a single plastic anymore, if they can't make virgin plastic anymore, for most things, that would be amazing. Or if they had to deal with it, like, if, okay, you can make that, but you actually have to take it back, and you have to figure out how to dispose of it. That would change the entire plastic industry, But they're, at this point, they're off the hook. It's cheaper to make virgin plastic than use recycling plastic. So most people are like, whatever, you guys deal with it. And then Americans and everybody across the world, we're so used to convenience, that we just sort of, everyone's got busy lives. They just buy the stuff and they throw it out. And that's got to change, right? Like, we just can't keep doing that. That there isn't an expiration date on us.
I think this is a great point, an inspiring point, and a hopeful point. albeit a very poignant point to conclude the conversation. I mean, not conclude the conversation, but end this current conversation. And then hopefully the conversation continues both on our end as well as on a societal level. Because as you mentioned, we're beginning to visualize it even more than before, which is a good thing. And art has done a lot to help that. I mean, your work has been inspirational for myself in terms of thinking about just the more human side of sanitation. You know, for someone who's been more conscious about what I do throw away, I applaud a lot of people that I see around me too, because I notice in my neighborhood in Queens, we're really raising the bar here with our compost. In Queens, I just saw a statistic here that Queens is one of the best. It's the best in New York City and in the nation as well, in terms of the compost we're actually putting out there. And so we are changing the narrative around what we think about in terms of waste and how we are responding to these crises, having these discussions about climate change and showing how wide-reaching it can be and the effects of it that go beyond what we can see. You know, it's the invisible effects on it. Making it visible is something that's necessary because a lot of people, I mean, I don't want to say they lack the critical skills to do it because they don't. That's what education does. Art is educating people to make those judgments and to see it. But it takes that visual aspect for many people. Not everybody's going to think about that. Not everyone wants to think about it. But when you have something so powerful and captivating as a work of art, which they're looking at some of the work that you make, these beautiful prints, draws them in. And the thing with art too is art forces you to slow down and to look at things and to really observe. And through that, you know, when you're making art in collaboration with agencies that are providing social services, environmental services, you're getting people to slow down and to really contemplate and then connect that art between their lived experiences. And that's a great way of raising awareness. That's the educational value. There was something really that I highlighted in your book. One of the impetuses behind you making art and getting into this way of thinking and interacting with materials and the environment and other people. I really love what you said or wrote in the book when you wrote that art is a productive survival strategy in times of crisis, and how you consider it to be a form of mindfulness. That's in a way, it's both spiritual, physically and emotionally empowering, and in ways that it inspires us, it motivates us to reclaim our balance and relationship to the natural world by taking an inventory of our consumption, waste, and disconnectedness with each other. I think that's a great point to end this on. You know, thank you for the inspirational conversation. I hope that people will now go over and check out the Sanitation Department's website, because they do have so many great resources there as well. They can see the work you're doing, also through social media. And at the Moving Image Museum in Astoria, Queens, you have an exhibition.
Actually, it just came down, but it was up for the month of January. And there'll be more, though. Exhibitions are great because they're just it's a space that can encapsulate a lot of these ideas and slow people down. I like what you said about that. That is something that art can do. You know, in a way, it's unique in that way. I think, you know, in terms of getting people to think about stuff, you know, you've got lots of people making, you know, poster campaigns or you know, engaging with the public, and they're all valid. But art is its own kind of unique lane, I think. That really can stop people, slow people down. Sometimes it doesn't have to play by all the rules either. You can create spaces that are abstract, or the work can be abstract. You know, the work can be sort of poetic, and, you know, in a way that I feel like if you just show people pictures of garbage, I don't know, like I do that sometimes too, but I feel like that doesn't always lead people to consider things. It's kind of overwhelming, you know. So as overwhelming as the real issues are, I think it's nice when art can be a language that like promotes mindfulness, you know, and in various ways. So I really like what you said there. And yeah, thanks so much for, you know, creating this platform. I think it's really important to have conversations, especially about art and especially about the world, and all that stuff is so interwoven in ways that can help each other. That's always how it starts, real dialogue with people and sharing that and sharing ideas. So thanks for doing this.
Well,
And thanks
thank
for all
you.
your writing too.
Yeah, thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Always a pleasure to see your work and the inspiring message of art as a form of survival, and not just survival, but transcending that.
Yeah,
We do need art. If we didn't need art, it would never have been the first form of communication and have
that's
been
right.
around for tens of thousands of years. We owe it to those ancestors that started the communication, and as a way of getting in touch with their world and figuring it out. We owe it to them to keep that going and to have it be a celebration of our world, and to learn from that and learn from each other. And I'm glad you mentioned that your process was just about learning. Learning was the main foundation of your process.
Artfully learning.
Artfully learning. That's what it means. Yeah. Living an artful life. It's just thinking like an artist.
It's a life, it's a life thing. It's not about just one artwork or one thing. It's a everyday thing.
Right. It's the everyday experience, and the good and the bad, but making it universal through this language that we all can find connection to. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I enjoyed this. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.